Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Advancement Center, and welcome to the continued reading of The Magic of Life by Robert Young, Chapter 30. Willie's hut was small, but the boat shed alongside it was monstrous and very modern. Henry realized then that Willie and John were the well known masters of the underground, the black market. They were the people who managed to supply what they needed when nobody else could, the people who stayed in the background and never revealed themselves. They had always managed to supply whatever Henry needed, providing he asked no questions. Andrew knocked on the door, but it was not an ordinary knock. It was like a demanding bash on the door. It was enough to wake the dead. Henry flinched. He would never have done the same thing himself. As he flinched, he looked away from the door and saw the large sign on the front of the boat shed, which read, Willie and John Brotlich. He had never heard of them before, but they were obviously well known in this little area of the island and obviously had great influence in the financial market. As the door was unlatched, Henry's attention came back to where Andrew was standing. The bright light within the hut flooded out and lit up Andrew as he stood there. It almost blinded Henry as he looked into it, but in a few seconds he could see the smiling face of the gentle character who stood in the doorway. Hi, Willie. We're here for the radios, explained Andrew. Come in, gentlemen. Come in out of the rain, said the round-faced man with a nice smile. He spoke very gently as he ushered Henry and Andrew inside his small hut. Willie was such a contrast to what Henry had visualized, but his warmth instantly attracted Henry. Henry stepped forward to shake Willie's hand and introduced himself. I'm Henry Olson, he said. So you're Willie Brotlich. Is that right? Yeah, that's right, answered Willie. Can I make you a cup of tea or coffee? Maybe a little bit of rum to warm you up? I'll go for all of the above. Thanks, said Henry. Coffee and tea? Asked Willie, a little puzzled. No, sorry, I'll have coffee and rum, thanks, said Henry. And I'll have the same, said Andrew. Willie turned around and cleared two chairs near the table and asked them both to take a seat. He then moved to one side to where the stove was already burning. It was a timber stove, and it warmed the hut nicely. The water was almost to a boil before Willie turned around and asked, So you need the radios, Andrew? Andrew said, Yes, we've got a problem, Willie. We've lost communication with the power station and half of the town. All our cables have been washed out, and we need to hook the plaza system back into the power station system. The only thing that can do it immediately for us are the two radios that I lent you. That's not a problem, but I only have one here. The other is on the other side of the island, said Willie. Andrew looked at Henry with a look of disappointment. He had not realized that Willie did not keep both radios together. How stupid, thought Andrew. His whole energy dropped, and Henry felt it immediately. Henry jumped in to prevent any ill feeling developing. It's all right, Andrew. Just hear Willie out, said Henry quickly. It's on the other side of the island, said Willie, but it's not far from the power station. But how are we going to get over there? Asked Andrew. Well, you don't have to, answered Willie. Henry began to laugh. Andrew was a great technician, but he had very little imagination. Willie had determined immediately that he could turn his radio on here and talk to the people at the other end and have the radio delivered to the power station. But Andrew, being a technician, had not even thought of that at this stage. Henry walked up to Andrew, who had already taken his seat, and said, Andrew, you're a bit slow. Willie knows exactly what to do. He'll have the other radio delivered for us. Willie laughed. He was quite a jovial man and very gentle. Henry wondered who his partner was and where he was. Being the person that he was, Henry did not hesitate to speak his mind. Willie, you got a partner, John. Is he part of the operation here? Asked Henry. Willie laughed again and said, No, John left a long time ago, but I'm still called Willie and John. Actually, John operates from the other side of the island, and that's where the other radio is. We still have 2 boats that we own together, and we still do a lot of business together, but I haven't seen John for a long time. Last time I saw him was when he came to collect the radio. But I thought you were partners, inquired Andrew. Yeah, we're partners, but that ended a long time ago. I still enjoy the fishing, and John does all the other stuff, replied Willie. Henry understood immediately that John was the black market expert and Willie was the fisherman. They had started the business together, but had obviously fallen out with each other. There was still a market, however, and there was still an income, so they kept their names together. Henry felt more comfortable about being in Willie's presence, knowing that the black market side of their business was not really part of Willie's nature. And so when the coffee was ready and the rum poured, they all sat down and warmed themselves in front of the fire. Andrew became aware of the fact that they were losing time, and so did Henry, who acted on it immediately. Henry stood up and announced, Willie, I'm afraid we have to get underway. So can you make that call and arrange for the radio to be in the power station within the next half an hour? Willie raised his eyebrows and said, I think it'll take more than a half an hour to get this one back, though. You leave that to us, said Henry. Willie shook his head and agreed. Fine, he said as he got straight on the radio and called John. Somehow John already knew there was a communication problem. Willie asked him how he knew all about it, and John had answered that he had already been down to the power station to see if he could communicate with anyone. He said that he stayed on the line just in case there was another call. The people at the power station had left a small radio with John so he could contact them if anything came through. Henry's eyes lit up and asked, Can I talk to John? Fine, said Willie, and he handed the microphone to Henry. Henry felt at home straight away. He had used many radios, and he loved the sense of being able to talk and then say, over, or over and out. It was a childhood thing that had made him sparkle each time he used the radio. It did not take him long to organize John to relay messages directly to the power station and then back to himself. He had quite a conversation with John. He organized everything for the next 2 hours, and he organized emergency procedures in case they did not get back in time. He also arranged for the base radio to be moved and connected at the power station within the next half an hour. Willie sat back and listened at this tall stranger gave instructions to people on the island that Willie had never heard of before. Henry finished his conversation and then in almost a boyish type voice and with a smile on his face said, Over and out, before he clicked off the radio. Willie stood up and said, Well, it sounds like you've got everything organized. Now all you have to do is get back to the plaza. Yeah, that's right, said Henry. Come on, Andrew, we better get going. Pack that thing up, make sure it's dry, and we'll get underway. Don't leave any pieces behind. Andrew laughed and said, Have you ever known me to leave any pieces behind for a radio? No, said Henry, but there's always a first time. Andrew stuck his thumb in the air and said, You looked after your bit, now look after mine, Henry. He then set up unplugging the radio. Willie Brotich was keen to help, and he said to Henry, You know, if I could just get a slight break in the weather, I could get you around there in a very short time, but I don't think this weather's going to break. Henry stood for a moment and asked, How could you get us around there in this weather? I have a special little boat that we use for running on bad nights. It'll take almost any sea. I've had it roll over many times and it's fine. It's a totally closed small cabin launch. It'll take 4 people comfortably, and I'd take it out in this, but I don't know if you two would actually survive, said Willie. So you think you could get us back there? Asked Henry. How would we get off the jetty in this bad weather? You couldn't get a boat in anywhere. Willie smiled knowingly and said, I can get a boat in and out. Andrew looked across to Henry and said, We wouldn't get as far as the turnoff. We wouldn't get as far as Joseph's Hill in a half an hour. Henry looked at Willie and asked, "Is it possible?" "I'll get you there in 20 minutes," said Willie, "but I hope none of you get sick in the boat. If you're willing to give it a go, then I can get you there. I just don't think there'll be a break in the weather, and it'll be a rather difficult." "You're on," said Henry. "We'll do it. We have to get back." The feeling that washed over Henry was amazing. He felt such a buzz, such excitement, and such approval from Simeon that he could not wait to get moving. "Come on, Willie, show us this contraption. We may as well go for it. And if we both wake up dead, well, we made a wrong decision," said Henry. All three of them laughed and headed out to the boat shed. Henry had seen a lot of boat sheds, but he had never seen one fitted out the way Willie and John Broltich had fitted theirs out. It was not just a boat shed. It was a workshop and had cranes everywhere and contained the most modern and up-to-date equipment and tools. Willie led them around the walkway high above the main docking area and around to the other side of the monstrous boat shed. They went down the inclined walkway and onto a flat platform that stood about 15 to 20 meters above the water. When they reached the platform, Willie stopped and said, "We're going into an area that nobody else has been in." What had looked like a simple little workshop suddenly opened up, and Willie revealed a major shaft that went all the way down to the water. And there, hanging in front of them on a large winch, was a most unusual looking boat. Henry had known about research and submarines and that sort of thing from his time in England, but he had never seen anything like this one. It was a cross between a fishing boat and a submarine. On the bottom, it looked like a boat, but on the top, it looked like a submarine with two large propellers shining in the light out the back of the boat. On the front, it looked like it had two eyes. They were obviously lights and were fully protected and inserted into the hull. The top looked like a submarine. It also had large curved windows on the sides and front. In some ways, the whole thing looked like a small whale. It was almost the color of a whale. "Ask no questions and you'll be told no lies," said Willie. "I don't want to hear a word from either of you, and once we get there, I want you to forget everything you've seen. I know I can trust you both, and I know that what you've seen here will go no further." Willie's face changed as he spoke those words, and Henry could see his strength behind his smiley face. Andrew shook a little as he felt the intensity of the little round man who stood beside him. There was a strength that came from Willie that Andrew knew he could never go up against. Henry stuck out his hand and said to Willie, "Here, you have my hand on that." Willie shook his hand with a strength that Henry understood, and then out of nowhere, the door made a whirring sound before lifting open. It was like something out of a movie. Henry and Andrew looked at one another before Willie said, "In you go." Henry and Andrew took off their packs, threw them through the door, and then hopped in. It looked rather small inside, but once they moved into the right places, there was plenty of room, and the seating was quite comfortable. Willie hopped in behind them before the door suddenly closed again. Andrew, being a technician, wanted to ask Willie how all this worked, but he knew that he should not open his mouth or say a word about anything. He should just observe. They could hear the whir of the hoist and the sudden jerk as the boat let go from its specially designed mooring. They felt themselves start to lower down and down until they felt the boat enter the water, and then there was another whirring sound before the boat began to sink. It was an unusual feeling, and Henry was quick to ask, "What's happening?" Willie answered, "We're just going a few feet under the water so we can get out of here safely, and we'll stay under the water until we get into the open sea. We can't go far underwater because there's not a great deal of air, so just stay calm while we get out there." Willie was quite serious. Henry and Andrew knew they had to keep quiet and keep calm. Willie was obviously very busy with what he was doing, and the boat sank below the surface. There was a sudden roar of the engine starting as Willie pressed the start button. The boat propelled forward very quickly and stayed below the surface. As they moved forward, the lights came on, but the glare was enough to blind them. Willie was used to this, but for Henry and Andrew, it was some time before they could see again properly. Henry looked with great interest at what he could see in the water. Andrew looked around intently at all the gauges and lights and at everything inside. The special boat seemed to be like a mystery submarine. They had been moving for no more than 2 to 3 minutes when the whirring sound began again and the boat started to lift back to the surface. As it broke the surface, there was a pounding crash as a wave came crashing down on top of the boat and shook them all around. Willie yelled, "Hang on, we're in for a good one." He laid forward the throttles, and tremendous power came from the engine to propel them forward into the massive seas. The boat was thrown around by the waves, and the engine continued to push against the massive seas. Instead of going over waves, though, it actually headed straight into them. They spent half of the time beneath the water and the other half on top. As soon as they were away from the breakers, Willie pulled back on the throttle and allowed the boat to sit on top of the water and to move along in a normal manner. Well, normal for a big sea and almost cyclonic winds. It was a little beyond what either Henry or Andrew thought was normal. Willie eased back, relaxed, and said, "We're fine now. Another 15 minutes and we'll be back into the rough again, though." Andrew was amazed. He had no idea how Willie could possibly steer or see where he was going or even know how to get to where they were going. He desperately wanted to ask Willie how he managed all this. He read all the gauges and heard all the sounds, but he could not figure out how Willie navigated this small vessel through the pitch black waters, half under the water and half on top, and without having any references. Henry was just as curious, but they both felt the intense pressure from Willie to say nothing. So they sat there, Andrew totally frustrated and Henry thoroughly interested. For Henry, it was a magical trip, like a roller coaster, and when the boat flipped over, Henry just laughed, but not Andrew. He yelled. Willie had sat calmly and said, "Just wait, fellas. It will right itself." Sure enough, within a few seconds, the boat rolled back to normal and carried on as if nothing had happened. Andrew was amazed at the fact that nothing had moved in the boat and they had remained strapped into their seats and hardly felt a movement. The boat turned over completely and they came back up again. It was as simple as that. There was not one thing out of place, and it was as if that was what the boat was meant to do. Then suddenly a light started to flash on the dashboard and the control panel lit up. Willie called out, "Hang on. We're about to approach the land again, and this run won't be as easy as the other one. We've got the sea behind us this time, and it's not real easy to handle. This is the one where you ask for assistance, and it's after this you wake up and find out whether you're alive or not." Willie had a big smile on his face as he spoke to Andrew and Henry, knowing that to them it was hairy, but to Willie this was the best part of the trip. Willie was an artist in his own way, and this special vehicle that he had designed himself under the name of Brotich was built by him alone. His cousin John could never master the special vehicle. They called it the Brotich Special and never told another soul about its existence. Willie enjoyed the trip at least once a day. For the last 6 months, Willie had had this vehicle purring and performing exactly the way he wanted. This trip was one of those trips that he would never have attempted unless there was a good reason. He was so excited about finally having the opportunity and excited about showing off his skills. When the boat almost turned on its nose, Willie accelerated straight down, almost to the bottom, and held the boat steady while a massive wave moved over the top of them. He then brought the boat back up again to follow the wave without any vision at all. Henry's heart was in his mouth, and Andrew thought he was going to be sick. But for Willie, the thrill and the feeling of total skill met his needs of the day. As soon as that was over, he settled in for the many thrills on the way into shore. The final part of the trip seemed like it took much longer than the early part, and even if they had have traveled traveled directly out to sea, the trip back was much longer than either Henry or Andrew had anticipated. It seemed like their half hour had gone many times when Willie told them, "Hang on, we're going down." The whir of the pump started in earnest, and as the boat moved down under the surface, Willie hit the accelerator and pushed the levers forward, and once again they felt the massive power of the engines in this little boat. The lights went on, and they could see the narrow cavern ahead. Willie was going as fast as he possibly could towards this hole in the rocks. Henry thought Willie was trying to give him a bit of a thrill, so he was watching and waiting for the point when Willie would pull back on the throttle and gently move through the rocks. That point never came, and the rocks came closer and closer. It seemed like Willie was having a great deal of difficulty lining up with the small opening. Both Henry and Andrew looked across at Willie to see what was happening, but Willie was calm and settled, and he was not struggling at all. The boat seemed to be moving all over the place, but Willie had total confidence. As the rocks loomed up, both Henry and Andrew were certain they were about to perish. However, at the last minute, Willie turned hard and dropped the levers back. It was like the boat almost stopped within a matter of less than 1 meter. The sudden turn lined them up with an entrance that neither Henry nor Andrew could see. The entrance was very wide and easily negotiated. Willie's confidence was totally justified, but Henry still felt strange. He had had a close call as far as he was concerned, and Andrew did not hold back. He swore in his Irish language, and he did not stop. He let loose with a string of obscenities that could not be repeated. Willie laughed with a belly laugh that almost shook the boat. Andrew's face went red as Willie tried to reassure him. "It's all right, Andrew. If I hadn't gone in there at that speed, I wouldn't have been able to keep the boat down, and we'd have run out of air. It's as simple as that." Andrew slowly settled, and his face returned to its normal color. "Well, you sure fooled us, Willie. Well done," said Henry. Thank you. Thank you very much, gentlemen. We'll now start to prepare to get this boat back to shore. We've still got a long way to go yet," said Willie. Henry then shifted his focus back to the outside of the vessel and could see that they were traveling along a long channel between the rocks. He had no idea whether they could surface straight away or not. It seemed like they had been down for a long time, and he wondered about there being enough air. Willie then threw the engines into reverse, and the boat came to a standstill. The pump started to whir, and the boat came to the surface as it splashed out through the surface and into a cavern. It was like a cave where you could see the light coming from one corner, but you could not see any opening. As soon as they got to the surface, the door mysteriously opened again with that familiar whirring sound. Once it was open, Willie said, "I'll hold it steady, but one of you has to get out into the water and pull us up against the side." Henry looked at Andrew and said, "I'm not going out there." "Well, I'm not going out there," Andrew protested. Willie smiled and said, "It's okay. I was just having you on." They all laughed and enjoyed the joke together as Willie edged the boat forward. He turned a hard left so that the lights gradually lit up the jetty, which was built deeply in the side of the cave. As the boat moved in, Henry marveled at the engineering. The boat simply moved into a set of slides, and as Willie increased the power in the engine, the boat lifted slightly in the water and settled on the cradle. Willie cut the engine, and they could hear the sound of a winch as the boat began to lift again, similarly to the other end. Up they went, through not quite as far this time, and the clunk of the brakes brought them quickly to a stop. All this time the door had been open and plenty of air came rushing into the boat. Willie shut everything down and quickly hopped out. "Wait until I get the lights," he said, and with a flick of a switch, the lights came on. They were very yellow lights with low brilliance, and Willie warned, "Be careful, gentlemen. We don't want to lose you now." As Henry and Andrew unlocked their packs and got out of the vessel, Willie said, "I've got to ask you once more to forget where you are. I'm going to take you via a back route so you don't get back to where we are now. But I do know you're intelligent beings, and you will trace it if you need to. I would just ask you not to." Once again, Henry put out his hand and took Willie's hand, He said, "Today, Willie, you may have saved many thousands of lives. We appreciate your effort, and I assure you we will not pass on this to anyone." Willie smiled, and he knew Henry meant exactly what he said. He turned to Andrew and said, "Andrew, I know you'd love to understand all of this, and if it stays a secret, there will come a day where I will tell you all about it." Andrew smiled and knew that he would keep Willie's boat a secret because he needed to know how all this worked and how Willie managed to do it. He realized that one day he would work with Willie and that Willie could use his expertise. Henry could feel what was happening between the two men and said, "I'm glad you two have a mutual interest, but can we now get on with what we're here for? Make sure you've got that radio, Andrew. We need to get it online very quickly. Come on, let's go." Andrew turned to Henry with a slight scowl on his face and was ready to attack, but when he saw Henry's face with a big smile, he settled once again and said in a very Irish tone, "Henry, you're nothing but a low-down leprechaun." Henry laughed. The Kelly language was unique. It was Irish and it was rough, but very endearing. Henry knew that the statement Andrew had made was as good as saying, "You're my greatest friend." So off they went down a long corridor and into a dark space that Willie knew like the back of his hand. It was almost totally black, but the feeling of stone around them and the cold indicated to Henry and Andrew that they were heading through a tunnel system in the same mountain that Henry's access door went through. Then suddenly Henry realized that his tunnel and the other tunnels, as well as the one they were now walking through, were part of the old mining area. People who had long passed had dug into these mountains to find gemstones, and many had been killed when the mountain moved and Norwood came into being. He soon realized that he was in the area almost behind his own house when he saw the light coming down from a shaft from the surface. As they turned away from the light, Henry knew that he was about to come out through one of his own buildings. Sure enough, they came to a door and walked straight through. The door was unprotected, and there was no lock on it. It was just a swinging door. They walked through and found themselves in the kitchen of the oldest hotel on the island. Henry could not believe where he was now standing. It was like he had just walked out of the freezer or storage room, and here he was. Willie said quickly, "Don't look back, just keep walking." They walked through the kitchen and out into the dining room before making a sudden turn along the servery area and then out into the street. "Is that it?" asked Henry. Willie simply said, "Look, I'll see you later," before disappearing back through the same door they had just emerged from. Henry and Andrew soon realized they were standing there in the middle of the street with all of their equipment and immediately regathered themselves and set on their way to the plaza, which was only 2 blocks from where they were standing. It was like they had been dumped in the street from another dimension and almost like they had appeared out of nowhere. Only a few minutes before, under the sea, and now here they were heading towards the plaza, and sure enough, well within the time they thought would be critical. The rain had increased its velocity and the wind was blowing almost horizontally along the street. The winds of the surrounding buildings rattled as they walked towards the plaza. Henry knew that this was the beginning of a critical time. He looked along the main street as he rounded the plaza and could see there were several trees down. They were lying across the street. Andrew had the radio in his hands, and as they entered the plaza foyer, and he walked straight to the elevator without even looking at Henry, almost as if Henry did not exist. Henry felt this sudden disconnection, so he headed towards the change rooms, which were located behind the reception desk, so he could tidy himself up and make himself look presentable. As he walked towards the foyer, the attendants behind the desk looked relieved, and Henry had a little difficulty convincing them that he should clean up first. In the 10 steps that it took to pass the reception desk, Henry solved at least 50 problems. The whole place started to relax again as Henry headed towards the showers to clean up and change into his spare set of clothes. He always kept a change of clothing in his locker room, just in case. As soon as Henry walked into the locker room, Mary appeared in his mind. He knew that she was anxious to contact him, so before he showered, he sat quietly and allowed himself to be present with these feelings. He knew that Mary could feel his presence and that she had felt his return, so he enjoyed sitting there for 5 minutes, feeling Mary's presence. While he was sitting there, his communication was clear, and he was sure that he was speaking with Mary and speaking with Simeon all at the same time. Just then, the clang of the locker door brought Henry back to the present. He looked around to see Andrew standing before him. Andrew had slammed the door on the way past. He was not in a good mood. He quickly said to Henry, "Henry, that pair has changed the frequencies on the radios. I can't talk to them the same as I used to. I'm having difficulty hooking into our system. What am I going to do?" Just then, as if a voice came out of nowhere, Henry heard the answer and repeated it to Andrew. "John Broltage will be able to answer your question as soon as you talk to the other radio. There's nothing wrong with the intercommunications. Just talk to the other end and find out what they've done. I think you'll find it's something very simple." "But I can't get a hold of the other end," said Andrew. "But we spoke to him. We spoke to John. I spoke to the power station. You must be able to get through," said Henry. Andrew stopped for a moment and said, "You're right. So what's going on? I just can't get them at the moment." "Come on, we better both go down and have a look," said Henry. So without getting changed, Henry followed Andrew out of the locker room, down in the elevator, and into Andrew's workshop. As he walked in the door, he saw a small module lying on the floor. He bent down to pick it up, and as he caught up with Andrew, Henry said, "This little thing was on the floor. You may have dropped. It might be off some piece of equipment." Andrew looked at it and quickly said, "That's the frequency module. I'm an idiot. The frequency module has dropped out when I've opened the cover. No wonder I couldn't talk to them. Thanks so much, Henry." And off he went back into his own world, back to the radios, opening covers, pulling bits apart, unplugging things. And as he snapped the module in, he said, "Ah, that's it." He then picked up the microphone and said, "This is your baby, Henry. Start talking while I arrange for the connection through to our telephone system." Henry felt the little boy inside him again as he picked up the microphone. Power station, this is Plaza. Henry speaking, over." A crackling sound followed, and then it cleared, and the power station came through. "Power station talking, over." Henry felt proud of his effort and said, "I'll hand you over to Andrew now. Andrew Kelly's his name, and he'll tell you how to hook everything up so that we're all in communication through the telephone. Over and out from me." Henry let go of the microphone and put it on the table and said, "It's over to you, Andrew. I'll see you later." Andrew stuck his head up from behind the exchange and replied, "Roger, Henry. I'll talk to you later." He then went back to his work. Henry turned and began walking away, but before he left, he spun around and called out, "Andrew, you'd better talk to the power station and tell them where to start. Otherwise, you'll be finished and they won't even have started." Andrew looked up and said, "Right. I didn't think of that." He immediately rushed out and picked up the microphone. Before he had said one word, though, Henry had disappeared and was on his way back up to the foyer. He knew that by the time he had a shower and got dressed, the communication systems would be back online and everything would be back to normal. Just as the lift was about to open, he felt the presence of Simeon again. He stopped all thought and focused on the feeling. Just as the door opened, Simeon said, "Stay for a moment." So Henry let the door close again and the elevator sat there. "Henry, you must leave all this and go back to your home and then go and find Mary. By the time you reach your home, your telephone will be working once again," said Simeon. Suddenly, the feeling was gone and Henry felt strange. It was like he had popped back into the world all of a sudden, and there he was standing in an empty elevator. His focus changed and he pressed the button to open the door before moving out into the corridor and headed straight up to the reception counter. Henry said, You people will have to look after this. I am off. I've got to go back home and then go and find Mary. Communications will be back in order soon, so you'll be able to reach me either way or at Mary's. The attendant stood behind the desk and saluted Henry once again, and in the same fashion as earlier, Henry stuck his thumb up in the air and said, "Roger, I'll see you later," before heading out into the storm. And that ends chapter 30. And the next time we meet, I will be reading from chapter 31. So for now, I wish you a perfect life, perfect health, and a magic life and a magic future. Thank you.